Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin, daf ayin. We're going to get started with a quick review of the end of yesterday's daf, and we'll finish up yesterday's daf and move on to today's. So we started with the Mishna, where we had an animal that had a firstborn inside. It was having trouble in childbirth, and we basically end up having to abort the fetus. And there's two ways that happen. One is if you cut them in parts, then take them out, then you just throw it to the dog. The animal was never sanctified. However, the fetus. But if already the majority came out, then it has to be buried. Okay, because then it has the sanctity of the bechor. Then we moved into these two machlokot. Okay, the first machlokot between Raba and Rav Huna is if a third of the animal comes out and you sell it to a non-Jew, and then the rest of it is born. Okay, now you sold. Let's just go through the case again. Okay, a third comes out, and when a third comes out, this is not where the fetus dies, the fetus survives, but there's a different possible exemption, which is once it's part owned, then we'll see why this connects in a little while. We're going to get to a difficulty on Rav Huna's position from our Mishna. That's why we're here. Okay, but let's just move away from the Mishna momentarily. If the firstborn is sold, let's just say a firstborn who is jointly owned by a Jew and a non-Jew, is exempt from the laws of bechor. And likewise, if the animal is a bechor, you also can't sell it because it's not yours to sell, because you have to give it to the Kohen, so it doesn't really belong to you, it's sanctified. So those are two things you have to know for this. So again, a third comes out, you sell a third of it to the non-Jew. So the non-Jew is a partial owner of this animal. So therefore, when chazar v'yatza shlish acher, when another third comes out and now the majority of the animal is out, theoretically, it should be sanctified, but Rav Huna says, right, and Rav Huna actually says it's sanctified. But Rabba Amar Eino Kadosh. So Rav Huna says it's Kadosh because he says it goes lemafreya, it goes retroactive. When the majority of the animal is born, we then say, oh, well, from the moment it started coming out, it was really sanctified, which means that you couldn't have sold it to the non-Jew because it wasn't yours to sell. But according to Rabba, it's not Kadosh because he says, Mikanu la'abau Kadosh. It only kicks in at the moment the majority was sold. At that point, it's not going to be sanctified because it was already owned by a non-Jew because your sale was valid. Okay? So that's their machlokah. That's what we saw yesterday. Now we're going to see Azdu l'tamayu. Now they are consistent within their opinions. Now, pay note here. In our sugya, Rav Huna said kadosh and Rabba said not kadosh. In this situation, we're going to flip positions, but only flip the psak. Kadosh and Eino Kadosh. So Rav Huna said Kadosh is going to say Eino Kadosh here, but for the exact same reason as he said it there. So let's see the case. Now we have a completely different case. Very strange case. To Itmar, Yatza Shlish Derech Dofen, Ushne Shlish Derech Rechem. If an animal is born C-section, that's another exemption. There's no bechor. What if the first third was born through C-section, and the second 2/3 of the animal was born irregular, right, from the womb? Okay, now this is very strange. How can that be? The only way you could do this, okay, you can't have a birth going that way and a birth going that way. So you would have to say that this was a stillborn birth, and the animal came part of it out through C-section, then they cut it off, and then cut off the part that came out, and then the rest of it came out through the rechem, through the womb. So that's how you would have to. Okay, you'd have to say, otherwise it doesn't make any sense, this case. So now, what happens? So if the shlish went out derech dofen and shlish derech rechem, so what do you have? Let's just look at it from the outside. You have a majority being born in the normal manner, except that when you got to 50% of the animal, right, when you got to the birth where 50%, 51% of it was out, you didn't actually have a majority coming out through the rechem, right? You had a third already came out, the way that disqualifies it from being a bechor. So Rav Huna Amar Eino Kadosh, Rabba Amar Kadosh. Rav Huna Amar Eino Kadosh, so like I said, Rav Huna in the previous case said Kadosh. In this case, not Kadosh. Why? Because it's a completely different situation. Rav Huna l'tameh is consistent with his opinion to Amar lemafreya Kadosh. He says when the animal is born, we go as if retroactively it started from the beginning. Now, if we start from the beginning, you end up with a third born, not the proper way of, the way that's going to determine it's a bechor, and then a little bit more in that way. But since we count from the beginning, when the majority of the body came out, it wasn't done in the way that would actually make this a firstborn. Veruba kama leita berechem, right? The first rove was not coming out from the womb. Raba amar kadosh, Raba l'tameh, amar mikanu la'aba kadosh. He says, we only look at it from when it's actually born. So, Ruba derech rechem nafak. Now, when it actually starts coming out in the normal manner, so then now you have a majority, because we start from there, and then we say, well, it starts from there, the majority was actually born properly then. So it all depends on where you start counting from. So now the obvious question is why we need both. If they're both the exact same basis, why do we need to say in both cases? And this goes back to the fact that the answer is going to be that if you notice, Rav Huna said kadosh, and then Rav Huna said not kadosh, and Rabba said eino kadosh, and then said kadosh. So, right, you're obviously going to be more stringent if you're saying the animal sanctified, and more lenient if you say it's not sanctified. So we're going to say it like this. If you had case one, you would have said, Baha ka'amar Rav Huna, there Rav Huna was stringent, and said kadosh, because mishum, and that's why he said his position, we're going to count lemafrea, because that's going to mean the animal is actually sanctified. We're going to start from the beginning, and in the end he couldn't have sold it to the non-Jew. Mishum de lekula. Now this is a little strange, because it's really lechumra, but what they mean to say is a very weird way to say it, because he didn't want to go lekula like Rabba. In other words, he wanted to avoid being lenient. Aval behachta lechumra, but in the second case, you might say, since Rabba's position is the more machmir position, that it's sanctified, ema modile l'Rabba. If what's motivating Rav Huna is a principle of lemafrea, then of course he's going to say different things, and he's going to say what he said. But if his whole position is, well, let's just be stringent in both directions, then he would actually hold like Rabba in the second one. And likewise, the same exact idea going the other way. Eat mar baha, if you had only case two, you would say Baha kama Rabba. That's where Rabba says it's kadosh, because he wanted to be stringent. Aval Baha, but maybe in the first case, Rav Huna, he would say, yeah, but to be stringent, we'll count it going retroactively. Okay, and then again, it won't be sold to the non-Jew, and then so it's the same idea here that we wouldn't have necessarily known, because we might have thought, since each one is stringent and lenient in each case, right? You might have thought maybe they would keep a consistent stringent position. Okay, now we bring the difficulty on Rav Huna from our Mishna, and now we understand why this all connects. Because Tnan, hamivakeret hamaksha leled, mechatech ever ever umashlich leklavim. Now, why is this a difficulty? Because if you cut each piece that comes out, right, and then you throw it to the dogs, well, as soon as the majority of this stillborn animal comes out, theoretically, it should be sanctified. Because if we say, right, like Rav Huna, that limafrea, then when the majority comes out, even though right now there's just piece, right? But it goes back retroactively. It was actually all sanctified. And therefore, when each piece comes out, and in the end you end up with majority out, you say, that's the Bechor and that should be buried. Why should it be any different from Yatsa Rubo? Because basically, according to him, Limafrea, we go retroactively, and then Rove, as soon as Rove gets out, even if it comes out in pieces, it should be sanctified, and you shouldn't give it to the dogs. Right? My lav mechatechu meniach. Right? How did you imagine this case? Katzalim leaves it. Katzalim leaves it. Katzalim leave it, because he's basically trying to save this animal. And then at the end, he's got this pile of the pieces of the animal. Within it, there's a majority. If we go retroactively, say, oh, from the beginning it was sanctified, whole thing's sanctified, you have to bury it. That's not what it says. And then, how do you give it to the dog at the end? To which they say, right, Iyamar lemafrea kadosh. Here's the problem. If you say it's lemafrea, then yikaver mebaile. It should have said you bury it. To which the Gemara says, lo, who says you left it and basically ended up with a rove at a certain point? No. Okay, now, again, I don't think that you were busy, every time take out a piece, give it to the dog. But there was a dog sitting there, let's say, right? And the idea is that every time you cut a piece, the dog ate it. Every time you cut a piece, the dog ate it. There was never a birth of a majority that was out there at any given point. So you can't say then, lemafrea is only once you have the majority out, but the majority doesn't exist anymore. So you can't go saying, oh, based on the pieces that are now gone, because the dog ate them, we can say there's a majority. And that's why. Okay, so now they say, wait, but according to what you're saying, but then you're really saying that if he cut them and left all the pieces of the animal, you would have to bury it, right? Sounds reasonable from what we just explained. If that's the case, then the Mishna should have talked about that case. Because, Adatani Sefer, what was the Mishna doing? It was comparing a case where you don't have to bury it, to a case where you do have to bury it. So it should have, Adatani Seifa, Yatsa Rubo Yikavel. If you're ready to bring in the Seifa, a case where you have to bury it, Viniftiram and a Bechorah, and there's no, right, it's not a Bechor, Liflog V'lidei B'dida, you should have already distinguished within the first case. What's this talking about? When you cut and throw to the dog limb by limb, and you don't end up with a majority ever. It should have said in the Mishnah, but if you cut and leave it, then you have to bury it. To which the Gemara answers, interestingly, Hachinami Kamar. That really is what the Mishnah meant. Even though it didn't say it, read the Mishnah as if it said that. And that resolves the difficulty according to Rav Huna. Read it like this. Right, where do we say you send it to the dogs? If you cut it and give it to the dog immediately. The second part, when it says yatzarubo, they don't mean yatzarubo. They mean if you have a case like this where it's like the majority came out, which would be if you cut aver and leave it there, and then you end up with a majority, it's as if yatzarubo in a normal manner, the majority came out all at once, and you would have to bury it. Okay? And that's how they reread the Mishnah. Okay, now we're going to start with a series of questions that's going to take us all the way to the end of Amud Aleph and to the end of this Mishnah. Okay. By Rava. Rava asks, okay, the first question is one kind of question, and then we're going to have a series of questions that all are basically very similar. Do we follow laws of majority when it comes to a limb? Meaning, does the limb follow where the majority of the limb is? Okay, we don't yet understand the question. We're going to have to figure out what they mean here. Hey chidami, what's the case? And they're going to introduce this as an ilema. If you say this, no. So then it must be, by process of elimination, it'll be something else. Ilema kigon shiatza rov b'miut ever. Maybe it's, right, if you want to say it's the case where 51% of the animal is out, okay? But one of the limbs is the minority of a limb. And here goes the question. There's one of the limbs that came out. Of that 51%, there's a certain percentage, let's say 3%, of a limb that's out, where that limb, let's say 20% of that limb is out and 80% is still inside. Become a baile. Here's the question. Again, this is a question we're going to reject, but do we follow the majority of a limb? Would be like this. Hi mi'ut barai, the minority that's out, that 20, right, the 3% of this 51%, which is made up of a limb that's, let's say, 20%, like I said, of a bigger limb, where the rest of 80% of the limb is inside. But tarov de ever shadin alei? Do we go by the majority of the limb? Do we say, look, 80% of that limb is inside, so we're going to even count the 20% as if it's inside, and that's going to drop us to only 48% came out. So even though really 51% came out, since the minority, right, there's a small part, well, not the minority, there's a small part of that 51% that's made up of a minority of a limb, and that limb follows the majority, which is inside. So we can't include that in the count. Oh, or in other words, this was a question. The other flip side of that argument would be, oh, but taruba de ubar shadin alei. Or do we go by the majority of the ubar? Is the fetus majority of it out or not? Do we care about the limbs, right? In this case, we wouldn't care about the limbs, and we'd say no, 51% went out. Okay, that would be the question. But we already know they're going to reject this because they say, pshita de lo shafkina ruba de ubar vazlina batarov ever. If really 51% came out, there's no way we're going to say, oh, well, look at that 51%, as if the small percentage inside is actually a minority of a limb, and that should be considered inside. That makes no sense. And again, 51% came out. It's majority. Okay, so that can't be the question, because that's pretty obvious. Ela, kegon sheyatzah chetzro berov ever. What if you have 50%? Within that 50%, you have a limb that's 80% out, 20% in. So now, kamabayli, here's the question. Hahu mi'ut debikavai, the minority, that 20% of that limb that's inside, ma'u lemishtia batarov ever. Can you just say, look, since 80% of that limb is outside, it's as if that limb is completely outside. And then that gets us up. We get another 20% of the limb, which is going to get us over the 50% margin. So then we'd say, oh, there's a majority, even though really a majority didn't come out. But if we say, and again, this is Rava's question, Do we follow Rov in limbs or not? So do we say, since that limb might be inside, but it goes with the limb that's outside, the majority's outside, we view it as if the whole thing came out already? Right? Do we take the part that's inside and say that really goes but like the part that's outside and we're over 50% or not? So let's try to get to an answer. And where are we going to get an answer from? This is why they brought this question up here. We're going to learn from our Mishnah. Tashma yatsa rubo hareze yikaver. If the majority comes out, then it gets buried. Okay, how did we get it from here? It doesn't really relate to our case. Well, they're going to say it does. Why? They're going to say something interesting. My rubo. Now, when it says yatsa rubo, it gets buried. Well, ilema rubo mamash. If you say the majority of the animal came out, which is how we read it, right? If the majority of the animal comes out, it gets buried. Ad hashtalosh mina de rubo kekulo. Right? Have you been learning Daf Yomi? Right? Don't you know? Haven't we seen many sugyot that the majority is as if the whole thing? Right? Rov simanim. Rov, right? We have majority in a million cases. So I don't need a Mishnah to tell me if the majority of the body comes out, then it's sanctified, because that's completely obvious for many other sugyot. The Mishnah is not telling you something that's so completely obvious. Ella, so what must it be telling you that we follow majority? That we follow majority of the limbs, and if there's a limb inside, and that limb inside, the little bit, can get us over to 50% if we consider it outside, right? The majority had come out, but with the Rov Aver, we're going to get to majority. That must be what our Mishnah is talking about. In which case, we have an answer. Now, to read the Mishnah that way, right, is interesting. That's what they suggest. To which the Gemara says, no. You could also equally explain the Mishnah as the case one that we just mentioned. What we said is not the question. Maybe it's talking about Kegon shiatza rubo b'miut Aver. Maybe the majority came out with a minority of a limb outside, which maybe you thought would be counted inside. And what's our Mishnah coming to tell us? That we don't ignore the fact if Rov comes out. Even if there's a minority of one of the limbs, and you might have thought that is counted inside. No, the Mishnah is telling you that. So in the end, right, we had, 2 minutes ago we said that case was pretty obvious. Obviously, it's not as obvious as Rubo Kekulo, right? If it was so obvious, you wouldn't need a Mishnah to say it. But what we're basically saying is, we assume the Mishnah is not talking about a classic case of Rov, like we thought, but it could be talking about one of these two cases. We don't really know which one, and therefore we can't get a clear answer to Rava's question. Okay, by Rava. Rava continues with questions. Now, as I said, all these questions are really based on one general concept, which is, it talks about an animal in the firstborn. It's called Peter Rechem. It comes out of the womb. It exempts the womb, meaning like this one, it won't have another firstborn after this. There's this assumption or question about an assumption about, does it have to touch the walls of the womb? And the issue is going to be, number one, what if there's a chatzitza, an interposition, something that's blocking the animal and the womb, if they're not touching because there's something in between? Or what if there's too much airspace, the womb is huge, and when it comes out, it's not touching any walls of anything? Or we're going to have a series of questions. Does this create an interposition, and that's not going to then be considered a firstborn? Okay? So, by Rava, and you're going to see some of these cases are quite absurd, and we'll talk about that as well. Kracho b'siv. If you put, maybe someone can help me on the English translation of that, but it's wrapped with some sort of, I think this is the fibers that come from a palm tree, okay, bast. So if you put bast around it, it's got something around it. In other words, when you're taking it out of the birth canal, you wrap it in something. B'talitomahu. What if it's in a talit, a cloth? You put a cloth around it. B'shilyato. What if it's in the placenta? So the Gemara stops and says, B'shilyato orchihu. Wait, it comes out generally in its placenta. Ela b'shilya acheret ma. What if you put it in a different placenta? You wrapped it in some other placenta. Okay, now why do we need three questions that all seem to be saying the same thing? Because in the end, we're talking about there's something blocking the animal from the womb. So they say that each one, or you could explain that each one is kind of saying something new. So a sieve is just, the bast is unnecessary for any real purpose. The talit at least helps the animal. It warms it as it comes out. Shilyato is its type, right? It's similar. It's like from something that the animal has anyway, as opposed to some external item. So each one you might have thought was less of a chatzitza than the previous one. What if you wrap it and then so Rashi says achazto is feminine. He says it's the midwife is coming in, puts her hands in, and pulls it out. So if her hands are blocking, like she wraps it with her hands and pulls it out. Okay, Tosfot, and this is really interesting. It's a little off the daf. I like to kind of stick with the daf, but I couldn't resist. Tosfot takes big issue with Rashi, and he ends up taking Rabbeinu Hananel, who has a totally different girsa. But what's his problem with Rashi? He says, what's a woman doing there? A woman is not women might be midwives for babies. Women are not midwives for animals. And why is that? And we're going to see this in the next Mishna, that we have a case where the animal's giving birth and there's a roed, there's a shepherd. It was the shepherds, the men were shepherds. The women weren't shepherds, right? They don't go to hospitals or veterinarian clinics, okay, where maybe there would be a woman there. The women weren't shepherds in those days. I just thought it was interesting because it teaches you, you can get this whole idea about the times. Now, I just want to point out, why wouldn't they maybe just randomly give an example of a woman, right? They don't do that. They don't give examples of women unless it's a field that women are in. Like, if you remember, when we talked about cooking, the woman goes to her friend's house to cook in her oven because the women did that. That was some place where the women were found. Here, Tosfot says this is not a woman's place. She doesn't do the birthing of animals. Which, by the way, leads to another, it's not from here, but I wanted to go off on this other tangent. On the Hebrew side of our site, Rav Tubal Kahana gave a shiur this week on, what do you call it? I looked up because she said in Hebrew. I knew the term in Hebrew. 1 second. I'll get the term in English. Right, forceps delivery. Okay, if you do a delivery with forceps for a baby, are you going to then not be a bechor because you did a forceps delivery and there was a chatzitza between, right? The forceps are then preventing the baby. So if you have a firstborn, you have to do a pidyon haben on a baby that was birthed with forceps, because again, the baby's not coming out petarechem. So Rav Moshe has a tshuva, she quotes in there, which says, Rav Moshe Feinstein, that we don't learn humans from animals. It's very interesting. So, and he has a whole reason. Some people do. He says no, which is very interesting. Tosfot, by the way, is the way he reads the girsa is like Rabbeinu Hananel, that what is it? It's not achazto, it's achoto. And that we have a firstborn, we have two babies inside. One is a female, one is a male, because if the female comes out first, then, and what happened? She has her legs wrapped around the head of the male, and then her legs come out with it wrapped around the head of the male, and would that be considered, again, he comes out first because his head comes out first. On the other hand, it's wrapped within her legs, and then that would prevent him from maybe being a bechor because of the chatzitza, and that's a completely different case. Anyway, it's very interesting, the questions that come up. Okay, wait till we get to the really absurd case, and then we'll talk about what the value of learning absurd cases are. Hechidami. So what's the case of this? Now, here it could be either the krach tova chazto, or maybe all these cases. Idenafik derech reishe pitarte. If it went, now the question is, how are you wrapping the animal? The assumption is part of the animal must come out first, and then you had access to be able to do that. So if the head came out first, and then you wrap the rest of it, obviously pitarte, right? That's petarechem, because once the head comes out, that's as if the majority came out. That's considered a birth. Ela denafik derech margalotav. It must have come out feet first. And then again, not a majority yet, not a significant part yet, right? Because the head would be, even if the majority didn't come out, but the head came out, that's a birth. So it must have been like that, and then you wrap the rest of it. Okay, here comes our crazy case. Bilato chulda v'hotziato mahu. If a chulda, okay, what do you call it? Well, we had this whole thing, a weasel, or maybe we said it was something else, a rat, a kind of certain type of rat. Right, that was Shuli Mishkan's article, if you want to go back to it. Which reminds me, she had an article this week, wow, I'm blanking on, someone can remind me, I forgot to mention it in class, it was from Samachet, it was about, someone help me out here, the Wild East, yeah, but what was the topic? Oh, about Bechozai, right, about the place Bechozai, and whether it was a place with like bad people or not, and all these stuff about Bechozai, which always comes up in stories and in situations, so it's an interesting, thank you for reminding me what it was. Okay, now they say, if the chulda makes its way inside the animal, goes into the womb, swallows up the ubar, the bechor, and pulls it out. Okay, basically out inside the chulda's mouth. So the Gemara says that can't possibly be the question. Hotziato ha'afikte. Okay, she obviously took it out, which means then it goes back to all the questions of the other things. It's chatzitza, not chatzitza. So they say, okay, fine. Ela b'la'ato v'hotziato. She swallowed it up, took it out. That's just stage one of the case. V'chnisato. Then she goes back in with it still in her mouth. V'hikiato. And then she vomits it out, spits it out in the body. And then yatzame elav. And then it comes out a normal manner. So, Mahu, is this a normal manner or not? Because do we say it already came out and maybe this isn't coming out the first time? That's a whole separate question. Mahu. Okay, so you might say these cases are crazy, and there's a great footnote in the Koran which basically says, Gemara always brings a lot of theoretical questions, but really this is relevant nowadays for surrogacy and other kind of situations where a fetus is implanted, right? So there's all sorts of questions like this. That these sugyot, which sound so out there and absurd, end up being used to come up with what's the real principle here, what's the issue, what's going on, how does that affect it? Obviously here it's a little more complicated because we end with no answers to the question. Okay, and then of course that if you apply to surrogacy, then you would have to say the rules are the same for humans and animals, which I said is Rav Moshe thinks they're not. Okay, keeping on in our sugya here. You put two wombs, one up against the other, and the animal goes out of one womb into the other and then comes out of the second one. So, do we say, Didi patal, dilav dide lo patar, becomes the petarechem, the firstborn, of its own, but not of the second one because it wasn't born there. Right? This also leads to surrogacy issues, right? It was an implanted fetus, sort of, right, which then comes out, but it wasn't her own. And then what it would mean is maybe it wouldn't be a firstborn of that one, but it would mean that she already can't have a firstborn anymore because this was her firstborn, okay? Because this already, she had something in the womb, or maybe not, right? If we say lo patar, it has no effect on that second one because it wasn't created there. O dilma delav didei nami patar. Or maybe we say, no, that one ended up birthing him, so what's the difference whether, right, what's the difference whether it was conceived in her womb or not? Now she can't ever have a firstborn. Teku. Okay, here's our teku. None of these have any answers. By Rav Acha, niftechu kotlei bet harechem mahu. Rav Acha asks, what if the opening of the womb, the cervix, was so wide that it didn't touch anything on its way out? Avir rechem v'kadesh va'ika. Is it the airspace? Now here there's no chatzitza, but is it just the airspace that sanctifies it? O dilma nigyat rechem v'kadesh, or does it actually have to be touching on its way out for that to work? Right, where they got this idea that it has to touch and that you can't have a chatzitza, right? It's an interesting question, like what the source of this issue is, right? Because they say petarechem, and like it comes out of the womb, it sounds like you need to have some sort of contact with the womb. That seems to be the assumption here, or at least it's a question. Okay, by Marbar of Ashi, nekru kotlei betarechem mahu. What if they were not there anymore, the walls of the womb? So they say, ne'ekru halinihu. Okay, if they were ne'ekru, then they're not there. So of course not. Ela ne'ekru utlele lebitzavare. What if they were uprooted from their place and they ended up hanging on the neck of the fetus as the fetus comes out? So, bimkomam mekanshe, shalom komam lo mekanshe. Do we say they only sanctify when they're in their proper place? And here they came out of their place. O dilma, right? Or maybe shalom komam nami mekanshe, or maybe just coming out of the womb, even if it's not in its location. Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Zera. Last question. We finally get to Rabbi Yirmiyah. You would have expected him earlier in the sugya. He asks, Nigmemu kotlei beit harechem. What if the walls thinned out? Okay, some people say even like the inner wall was no longer and only the outer wall. Somehow they're like not the way they're supposed to be. Amarle kanagati bebayadi bailan. You're asking about something I already asked, and you can really get to an answer from the question that I asked. Debai Rabbi Zera, because he asked. Va'amarle bai mine Rabbi Zera mi Rabbi Asi. Some people say he asked Rabbi Asi. Omein mirubel parutz. You might remember this term from Eruvin and walls and all that. If you have more of the walls of the womb, and you have more standing walls than open walls, but you basically have all these breaches in the wall, and you have more though that are standing. But yatsa derech parutz. But the fetus came out through the open part. Parutz merubel haomed yatsa derech homed. What if you have the opposite? More of it is is broken, but it actually came out through the part that's actually there. So it did come out of the walls of the womb, but majority of the walls of the womb weren't there anymore. Now, comes Rabbi Zera and explains, my case that I asked about was when you have less there than standing. But there is part of it still standing. But your case you're talking about is there's no walls really at all. And now there are walls, but the real walls don't exist. And at least in the Omeid case, there were some proper walls of the womb. You're talking about a case where the walls of the womb are not really the way they're supposed to be. So for sure it's going to be a problem. Meaning it won't be considered a Bechor. Okay? With that we finish. Okay, so the majority of this stuff was just questions. Okay? And unanswered ones. Moving now to the next Mishna. And Amud Bet. Now we're talking about a different issue. Okay, you'll see this crossover, but we have a case where there's a fetus inside, and the fetus is dead in the animal. Here's the ro'eh. Here you see. Who's doing it? Not a miyaledet, not a female midwife, but a shepherd. Shepherd puts his hands inside to take out the parts of the body, the fetus that's dead. Now, this is a nevela, right? Nevela carries impurity. Well, comes the Mishna to say it doesn't matter kosher animal, doesn't matter non-kosher animal. Okay, we're not talking about a bechor here. We're just talking about an animal, a fetus, that died inside in utero. And basically, whether it's kosher animal, non-kosher animal, the shepherd that puts his hands inside and touches the parts of this dead fetus is not impure. There's no impurity of nevela. We're going to have to see why this is. Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer b'tzme'at tamei u'b'torah tahor. He says, right, we're doing an interplay of tamei and tahor. Tamei can mean impure, and tamei could mean kosher, not kosher, right? Tamei could be not kosher, and tamei could be impure, and Torah could be kosher, and Torah could be pure. So he says, b'tzme'at, in a kosher animal, it's tamei, it's impure. Kosher, non-kosher, sorry, did I say non-kosher? Non-kosher animals carry impurity of nevela, the fetuses of them. In a kosher animal, the fetus will not be impure. Now we have to figure out what's the root of their debate. My time at the Tanakama. So we start with Tanakama, and we're going to bring Rav Chisda, remember, because they're going to refer to him later. Okay? Rav Chisda brings a kavachomer. Amar Rav Chisda, kavachomer. Imo ila imo lahatiro ba'achila, lo to'ilo l'taro midei nevela. He says like this: if the fetus is inside, if the mother would have been slaughtered, what's the law? Ben Pekua, that fetus inside is now permitted to eat. So if the mother, now we're talking about kosher animals, obviously, not kosher animals. So in kosher animals, it's just a simple kavachomer. If the mother protects the fetus from being able to be eaten, right, it makes it kosher without shchita, then of course the mother's going to protect the fetus from impurity of nevela, because remember, the mother's alive. So if the mother's alive and she doesn't have impurity of a nevela, then neither does the fetus. Okay? And that's for kosher. Now we have to get to non-kosher. There's a very interesting way he gets to non-kosher. Eshkachan be'emat torah, be'emat me'aminela. And so where do we get that a non-kosher fetus isn't going to carry tumat nevela? Amar Kra, the pasuk says, okay, here's a pasuk in Vayikra Yud Aleph Lamed Tet, in that same chapter of all the kashrut. V'chiyamut mina be'ema. I want to read you the pasuk first before we see the drasha, because I want you to see the difference between the way the drasha reads the pasuk and the simple reading of the pasuk. If an animal dies, okay, now the next part is describing which kind of animal. Asher hi lachem la'ochla, which means this pasuk is talking about kosher animals. Okay, so if an animal were to die, if it's an animal that you can eat, hanogeh b'nivlatah yitma ha'erev. Okay, if you touch the nevela of this dead animal, you're impure. Now, what do they say? Amar Kra v'chiyamut mina be'ema, zo be'ema tme'ah. Asher hi lachem la'ochla, zo be'ema te'ora. So there's two phrases here. Now, even though obviously we read them as one phrase, if an animal were to die who is an animal that you can eat, that was all meaning kosher animal. Comes the world of drasha and says there's two phrases. The first phrase must be referring to a non-kosher animal, and the second phrase referring to a kosher animal. And now what do you see? One pasuk includes animal, kosher animal, non-kosher animal, and laws of nevela. So what do we learn from here? Itakish behemat me'ala be'oma torah. we're going to make a hekesh, a juxtaposition between a kosher and a non-kosher animal. In what area in the world of nevela, what element of nevela are they similar that we need a drasha to tell us? Because the fact that there's nevela in a kosher animal, non-kosher animal, we have separate psukim to tell us that. We don't need this to tell us. So it must be coming to tell you our topic, which is ma be'ema Torah ubara tahor, af be'ema tmea ubara tahor. Just like in a kosher animal, the fetus is going to be protected and won't be, right? Again, a dead fetus in the body of a live kosher animal is not going to carry impurity, which we learn from the Kal Vachomer. Same thing with a non-kosher animal, ubara tahor. And that's how we get it from this. We have to do two things here. We have to say that even though the pasuk is talking about kosher, it's really referencing also non-kosher. And then we're going to say for what is it similar? For laws of nevela relating to a fetus that's inside a live animal, which could be kosher or non-kosher. And that's the whole idea. Now we get to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, my time. I'm a Rabbi Yitzchak. Okay, remember again, this is Rabbi Yitzchak because we're going to go back and talk about him as well later. Rabbi Yitzchak brings a pasuk to Amar Kra. In the end, we're going to have two pasukim. And then we're going to say, why do we need the pasuk of Rabbi Yitzchak if we have the second pasuk? And that's what we're going to talk about at the end. So what's his proof? He says only kosher animals. So he says, to Amar Kra, he quotes a different pasuk which talks about nevela. Kol holech al kapav. Okay, this is Vayikra Yud Aleph Kaf Zayin. Okay, the pasuk we said before was Lamed Tet. Now we're in Kaf Zayin. Kol holech al kapav, any animal that walks on its paws, bechol chaya. Okay, now bechol chaya sounds like it's saying in any undomesticated animal, haolechet al arba, that walks on fours, to me'im hem lachem. Okay, they're impure to you. Kol hanogeh b'nivlatam yitma erev. Anyone who touches their nevela is impure. Okay, now the way they darshan this pasuk again, kol holech al kapav. Kapav they're going to explain as, okay, you have to remember, kosher animals have split hooves. Kapav are the paws without the hooves, without the split hooves, they're saying basically. They're going to understand kapav as not having split hooves. And olech al arba is also not having split hooves, because if you have split hooves, you're not olech al arba, you're olech al shmone. Why? Because each hoof has two, it's split. So each one is considered two. So we're going to talk about it in the pasuk, it says, right? B'chol chaya olechet al arba. So we have kapav means an animal without split hooves, and the second part, al arba, means an animal without split hooves. And we're going to say, b'chol chaya olechet. They're going to say not, what is it? B'chol, it's not in animal, it's inside. B'toch. Okay, b means inside. So now we're going to read this pasuk like this. Malchei kapayim b'chaya timeti lecha. A mahalech kapayim, a non-kosher animal, b'chaya, inside. Now chaya also means alive. Inside a live animal. Okay, which is holech al arba. So we're going to basically say, it's a very convoluted way to say it, but very simply this means that a fetus inside, right, a non-kosher fetus inside a non-kosher animal is impurity of nevela. And that's how Rabbi Yossi gets it. So according to Rabbi Yitzchak anyway. So now we're going to have a series of questions on this. If it has to be arba, an arba basically, like a holech al kapav in a arba, so there's all sorts of exceptions to this rule that aren't going to fit this rule. Ela me'ata kalut b'me'ei para litameh, t'malchei kapayim b'chayahu. If you have a kalut in the me'ei para, remember we learned that? This is an animal, a fetus, which has not split hooves, but it's inside a kosher animal. Now that should pass on impurity, because that's a mahalchei kapayim b'chayahu. That's a mahalech kapayim, a four, right? Four-legged, no split hooves, inside a live animal. To which the answer, no, it's, and this is where we get what I said before, which is malchei kapayim b'malchei arba, because look at the pasuk again. It says, holech al kapav b'chol hachaya holechet al arba. They didn't really talk about the holechet al arba until this point. To say it's not a kalut b'toch hapara is not going to be impure, that's because it's not mahalech arba. The para is mahalech al shmone. Okay. In other words, both need to be on fours. Okay, well, if we establish now both are four-legged and not eight, again, it's not really eight-legged, but with the hooves, v'hamalchei arba malchei shmonehu. So that's just saying that would be a malech arba, malech shmone. It's not part of the pasuk. Okay, next case. Para b'me'ei gamal lo titameh. If it has to be a 4-on-4, what if you have a para that was, do you have a fetus that's like a cow, which is inside a camel? Okay, again, these are weird cases, but they talk about them as if it could be. Now you would say that one then shouldn't be impure because it's not a shmona and an arba. It's a shmona and an arba, not an arba. It's not 4 and 4. It's 8 and 4 because the ubar has split hooves. So what you can say that's not impure? Of course it's impure. It's a non-kosher animal according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili. So they say, okay, for that one there's a special drasha. Holech v'chol holech l'rabot b'me'ei gamal, because it says v'chol holech al kapav. All that includes an additional case. If you have this weird exception to the rule where there's a para fetus inside a camel, well, that will be counted also, will be impure. Okay, kalut b'me'ei kluta litamei. Okay, what if you have a case where you have, okay, let's just remember what Rabbi Shimon said. Rabbi Shimon talked about the kluta, the kalut in a para. We have kalut b'me'ei para, and what does Rabbi Shimon say? It's a problem once it's born. Okay, if you have an animal with not split hooves, it's not going to be kosher, even though it was born to a kosher animal. But the rabbis disagree. Okay, Rabbi Shimon was lenient when it was a fetus, but said once it comes out, lavir olam, it's a problem. But the rabbis disagree with him. We didn't see the rabbis' opinion. The rabbis say it's actually completely kosher. So if you have an animal that was born to a para, but it doesn't have split hooves, and now it goes later, it's a female, and it gives birth to a kalut. So now we have a kalut inside a kalut. Now, that's 4 in 4, right? Because they have not split hooves. But they're completely kosher. But according to this rule, 4 in 4 is going to be a problem. It's going to be matame. You're going to say, litame malche arba, malche arbahu. So they say, this is why I told you to remember it. In this case, you have to employ the kavachomer of Rav Chisda. What did Rav Chisda say? Well, if you would slaughter the mother, the fetus would be covered by that, then obviously the fact that the mother's alive is going to protect the fetus from having impurity of the dead body, so a dead carcass. So that's how we resolve that one. But now we're going to have this one last question. We can't resolve it. For that, we're going to have a different pasuk. Matkif la Rav Achtavoy bar Ami. Chazir b'me'eh chazir taloli tameh. A pig. Now, a pig has split hooves. So a pig is an 8x8. So what you're going to say, a pig inside a pig is going to be not impurity, right? All of a sudden, that's not going to have impurity of a dead body. And that's not what the pasuk was talking about. It was 4 on 4. So because of that, we're going to bring a different pasuk. Now this pasuk is in the famous Korban Levi Yoreh that we've talked about many times, the sliding scale offering. And this pasuk talks about, okay, we've learned this a lot, but I'll remind you because you probably don't remember. Ela amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak mehacha. Nefesh ki tiga b'chol tamei, o b'nevelat chayat mea, o b'nevelat behemat mea. Pay attention, we're going to need this for later, also mainly tomorrow. The nevela of a chaya, who's a non-kosher chaya. The nevela of a non-kosher animal. Or nevelat sheretz tamei. Okay? If a person touches anything tamei, and the examples they bring, this we never really focused on this element of the pasuk, are a non-kosher carcass of an animal, a non-kosher carcass of an undomesticated animal, right? Be'eman chaya, or a sheretz, v'ne'elam mimenu, and he forgot, v'hu tamei b'Hashem. Now, what did he forget? He forgot he was impure, and what did he do? Now, never says this in the pasuk, but they darshan this, and we spent a lot of time in Shvuot and in Horayot on, forgot he was impure and went into the temple. Okay, it doesn't say temple in the pasuk. You have to assume he went into the temple, otherwise there's no punishment. You don't get punished for touching a nevela, you just become impure. Okay, but anyway, forgot he was... Now, what's strange about this pasuk, number one, is why is it only talking about non-kosher animals? If you touch a kosher animal that's in a carcass, you would also have impurity, right? So the pasuk is strange, why it's talking only about non-kosher animals. Right? If we're talking about you went into the temple, you were impure, you could have been impure from a kosher animal. So why does it only talk about non-kosher? They have to say this must be talking about a fetus, because there has to be some case where there's a difference between kosher and non-kosher, and that's the only case we can find. So it must be this pasuk is really coming to teach Rabbi Yossi Aglili's position that we distinguish between kosher and non-kosher animals, that the fetus of a non-kosher one will actually be impure, while the fetus of a kosher one will not be. So now they say, okay, so now that we learned from this pasuk, what do we need Rabbi Yitzchak's pasuk for? I told you, remember? He's the one who brought the first pasuk here, which was, right, what did Rabbi Yitzchak say? Kol olecha kapab b'chol achaya olechet, the 4 on 4, right? Which we then rejected because of the pig, but they obviously didn't reject it completely because of their going back to it and saying we have these 2 psukim. So we laughed to Rabbi Yitzchak, If we didn't have the drasha of Rabbi Yitzchak, we might have thought that this pasuk is completely coming for this drasha of Rabbi, which is that this pasuk is talking about Tumat Mikdash for Kodashav. And we wouldn't have darshan this at all. We would have thought this pasuk is meant only for that, and we don't darshan from this anything else. Okay, we're going to get to Rebbe tomorrow, so we'll see it inside. Okay, right now we're here. Okay, so now we're going to end with this bright of Rabbi Yonatan. And because we quote this pasuk, and because we're talking about nevela of animals, so we're going to talk like this. Nam tilo ben Azai. I said to Ben Azai, okay, Nam comes from Ne'um, is a speech, so it's just has the aleph kind of disappears. Nam tilo, I spoke to Ben Azai and I said to him, Lamanu nevelat behema Torah shemitama. And now that we quoted all these pasukim, we learned that we have a pasuk about kosher animals, their nevela is impure. Okay? That's from Ki Yamut Mina Behema Asher Hi Lachem Lo'ochla, assuming this is the simple reading. If you have an animal that's kosher and it dies, Hanugeh b'nivlata yitma erev. So we have kosher animal nevela carries impurity. Forget about fetuses now. We're off of fetuses. We're talking now about nevela of animals. Nivelat behemat me'ah shebetama, nivelat chayat me'ah shebetama. We have also, that's the pasuk we just saw, the one in the sliding scale offering. We have, if you touch, right, a nevela of a non-kosher animal, domesticated, and non-kosher, non-domesticated. What's missing? We have behemat Torah, we have behemat me'ah, we have chayat me'ah. We're missing nivelat chayat Torah lo labanu minayin. So Rabbi Yonatan asked Ben Azai, where's the source that also an undomesticated animal carries impurity? Namli, so he said to me, Ben Azai, Kol olecha kapav b'chol hachaya olechet. He quotes that pasuk before. The animal, right, b'chol chaya. Now, if you understand that without getting into the fetus like we did, chaya, it's an animal, right? Kol olecha kapav b'chol hachaya sounds like any animal on fours, which is a chaya, right, is tamei lachen. Okay, it's impure. So namtilo, I said to him, Rabbi Yonatan says, v'chinemar b'chol chaya, it doesn't say end all chayot. Halolo nemar ela b'chol chaya. Inside a chaya, which we already explained to be talking about a fetus. That's why this is coming up. He says you can't use that pasuk that's talking about a fetus. The chaya there is an alive animal. It's not talking about chaya, it carries impurity. It's actually telling you that a fetus doesn't, right? That the fetus of a non-kosher animal will be impure. So namli, so he said to me, Ma Yishmael omer b'davar hazeh. What does Yishmael say? Who's Yishmael? Rabbi Yishmael. Why is he asking Rabbi Yonatan what Rabbi Yishmael says? Because he says, that's your rabbi. What does he tell you? So namtilo. So then Rabbi Yonatan says, oh, well, what did he tell me? V'chi yamut min ha'behema zo behemat me'ah. Asher hi lachem lo'ochla zo behemat torah. Right, so we had as we darshan this pasuk earlier, the behema, chi yamut min ha'behema, that's a non-kosher. Asher hi lachem lo'ochla, that's a kosher. Lamanu, and now, once he says, all you need is that one pasuk, because that pasuk covers kosher, non-kosher, and once you have behema, lamanu chaya bichlal behema ubehema bichlal chaya. So chayat Torah bichlal behema Torah, chayat me'ah bichlal behemat me'ah. He says, sometimes in the Torah, and tomorrow we're going to get into all sorts of cases and go more in depth into this, sometimes in the Torah you're going to have cases where it says behema and it includes chaya. Sometimes you have chaya where it includes behema. So this pasuk covers behemat me'ah and behemat Torah, kosher, non-kosher, domesticated animals, and that's going to include the chayot as well. And that's all you need to see the laws of nevela applying also to a chaya. Okay, we'll stop here. We're going to continue in the discussion between Rabbi Yonatan and Ben Azai tomorrow. We'll finish up there. Okay, so let's do our quick summary. It's quite late, but at least we caught up. We started with this machloket Raba and Rav Huna, the two machlokot they have about does the kedusha of the bechor go lemafreya. Once the majority comes out, we go and say the kedusha happened before, or do we say the kedusha only happens from when the majority comes out? And there were all sorts of ramifications, the kula and the chumrah, in the two cases that we saw. Then we started with the questions we had. Do we follow, the limbs follow the majority? And then all the other questions about a chatzitza and coming out of the womb comes out with some sort of barrier or without touching the sides of the womb. Is that considered firstborn or not? Which we had a whole, left open a slew of questions. Then we got to the case of a fetus inside is not, if it's dead, the mud protects it from, there's no tumat nevela. Is that only for kosher animals or also for non-kosher animals? So Tanakh said both. Rabbi Yossi Aglili said only kosher. And then we had a whole discussion, what are the proof texts of each side? With that, we finish for today, wishing everyone a good day.